I often tell people that all real estate statistics are rubbery figures to a certain extent at least. It's all dodgy data and can't be taken as gospel truth. Unfortunately, media tends to present, particularly price data, as gospel truth. They'll get a press release from an organisation like Domain or CoreLogic, and they'll present their information that they claim about what's happening with prices in the major city as fact, but it's not fact. And they're apparently oblivious to the reality that if you get price data from 3 or 4 different sources and line them up alongside one another, you find that there are enormous discrepancies, and it's quite common for the information from one big name research source to contradict the figures from another source. One source will say that a particular market, a particular city's house market is rising, and another source will actually say it's falling at the same time. How can that possibly be? A lot of consumers say to me, isn't what's happening with prices a matter of fact? How can we have these discrepancies? Well, no, it's not a matter of fact. It's a matter of methodology, and they all claim that their methodologies are the best, but in fact they're all flawed. And when you consider what they're trying to do with the information they publish on prices, it's easy to understand why there are so many discrepancies. If you take Sydney, for example, this is a very large city, a very big metropolitan area. Right across the Sydney metropolitan area, there are more than 700 suburbs, and they've all got different things happening. What the research companies are trying to do is distill all the tens of thousands of sales that might happen in a market that big in a single year down to a single figure, which says this is what's happening with Sydney house prices, or this is what's happening with Sydney apartment prices. And it's an absurdity to even try to do that and come up with a figure that's actually meaningful, because quite apart from the fact that there are so many things thrown into the huge melting pot that spits out a single figure, there are myriad different scenarios playing out across a metropolitan area that big. At one point in time, a market over here might be rising, another market might be stagnating, and a third market might actually be falling. We don't have one situation across a city that big. If you work at the coalface in real estate, you realise that something different can be happening in this street, and the street around the corner can have a completely different scenario playing out, or houses on one side of the street can be worth more than houses on another side of the street. So once you understand that, you realise that coming up with a single figure to say this is what's happening with Sydney house prices is ridiculous, but that's what they do. So for all those reasons and more, we have a mountain of misinformation being published on a daily basis about what's supposedly, allegedly happening with house prices and apartment prices in the major cities of Australia. So I'll give you some examples. What we regularly do, and I do this when I do live seminars. I did one in Brisbane on Tuesday morning, and I put this slide up where it showed the latest price data for the 8 Australian state and territory capital cities from 4 different big name research sources, and showed how many conflicting pieces of information there were in that one slide. As an example, the 4 sources talking about the Adelaide house market, 2 of them say the Adelaide house market in the last 12 months has fallen in terms of the median house price, or the house price index, however they term it, but the other 2 say it's rising. So 2 sources say it's up a little, and 2 sources say it's down a little. Similar with Brisbane, some sources say Brisbane market in the last 12 months has risen a bit, but there are others that say it's down 2 or 3%. Who's right and who's wrong? How would the consumers know? There's no way for the average real estate consumer to make sense of these conflicting pieces of data. For Sydney, their housing market, according to CoreLogic, just to give you some actual real numbers, the latest figures from CoreLogic says the Sydney house price, median house price, is still down in annual terms 2.6%, notwithstanding the fact that in recent months it started to rise again. It's still lower than it was 12 months ago, according to CoreLogic, also according to Domain. And according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, their latest figures, it's still down 10%. But of course, the Australian Bureau of Statistics is always a long way behind. Their data always lags reality because, well, they're a government bureaucracy. That probably explains it, enough said. But their latest figures, which are behind all the other figures, say it's still down 10%, whereas CoreLogic says it's down 2.6%. But SQM Research, their latest figure says it's actually up. It's actually increased 1.7% in annual terms. So some sources say it's still down. SQM research says it's still up. For Melbourne, SQM research has Melbourne up a little bit compared to 12 months ago, about 1%. Domain says there's no change compared to 12 months ago. CoreLogic says Melbourne's still down 3%. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics says Melbourne's still down 10%. So you've got a range from plus 1% through 0, through minus 3% to down 10%. And they're all talking about the same market, Melbourne house prices. How can it be so? Hobart, they all agree that Hobart in annual terms is still up in terms of its house pricing compared to 12 months ago. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics says Hobart's up only 1.3%, which is basically saying the mini boom that Hobart's enjoyed is pretty much over. But SQM research says something quite different. It says Hobart's still up almost 10%. So according to SQM research, the Hobart mini boom is still raging. According to the Bureau of Statistics, it's over. And then you've got CoreLogic and Domain, who's sort of halfway in between the two extremes. And if you go through it city by city, you've got those sorts of discrepancies pretty much with every market across Australia. How can it be so? Well, as I said at the beginning, it's all dodgy data to a certain degree. You can't take it to the bank. You can't base big money decisions on this kind of real estate statistics. They're rubbery figures. Let's have a look at, just to further emphasise the point, what's the typical house in Sydney cost? What's the sort of the median for a house in Sydney? Well, according to CoreLogic at the moment, it's at $918,000. But according to the figures from SQM research, it's actually 1.3 million. Now, that's a very big difference. There's a difference of about $400,000 there. In Melbourne, SQM research says that the typical Melbourne house sells for about $970,000 at the moment, but CoreLogic says $750,000. That's a hell of a difference. I mean, it's more than 200,000 difference. The differences aren't quite so large when you look at apartments, but certainly city by city, there's massive disparity there when they're talking about what typical houses cost in each of the Australian capital cities. In Sydney, with apartments, the median price, or the typical house, according to CoreLogic, is $721,000, where SQM research says $708,000. So not so much of a difference there, but with houses, there's a massive difference. And so if you're a consumer trying to make sense of it all, are prices rising or falling, and if so, how much, and what's the typical house worth, you're going to get two completely conflicting pictures depending on, whose figures you believe. Do you believe CoreLogic? Do you believe SQM research? Do you believe Domain? And there are other sources out there as well, the real estate institutes, for example, and the Bureau of Statistics. And they're all contradicting one another on an almost daily basis. So how, as a consumer, can you make sense of it? Well, you can't. What you can do is get some good quality research reports from places like hotspotting.com.au, because we've put in a lot of effort into making sense of it all, gathering together all the data and try to make sense of it for you, so you can actually have some kind of idea of what's going on. And probably, in simple terms, the secret is understand that these generalized figures, one figure to describe an entire city, it's rubbish. It's absolutely worthless, pointless nonsense to even publish it, because it doesn't tell you anything that's in any way useful to you as a consumer. What we do is we look at real estate markets, sales volumes, vacancies, price trends, rental yields on a suburb by suburb, town by town basis, because it happens at that micro level. It goes right down to street level, where, as I said in the beginning, there can be a disparity or a difference between one suburb to the neighbouring suburb. And so you really do have to get information that goes right down to street level to fully understand what's happening with markets, with property values, with vacancies, and all those other things that media tends to ignore, but are really relevant to the decisions you might make as a consumer. So next time you see a bunch of figures, a table of figures published by the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, or some online source that you favour, and it says Sydney house prices have increased X%, ignore it. It's meaningless. It's not telling you anything that's useful that you can actually use and help you to make good decisions about how you're going to spend your money as real estate consumers. That's it for now. Terry Ryder from Hot Spotting. That's this week's edition of The War on Misinformation. Let's do it again, same time next week. Bye for now.